sound going. I appreciate that. Yeah. I know it takes a lot to get up for you.
I'm living somebody else's dream. I don't like it. But that's what I'm doing.
He said it's not my dream.
I'm trying to get
A little bit more sound. Good. Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get into our seats. Let's get to studying together for a few minutes. I want to lend this plane. I've been traveling down Samaritan roads for now 5 weeks. So I wanted to wrap up this topic. Samaritans are fascinating people. They're very, very interesting to study. People know little about them. There's a few of them still left in the world. So if you ever have a chance to visit the Samaritan village on Mount Gerizim, they are open for visitors. They have a visitor center. They're very friendly people. They will probably load you up with all the information you could possibly take. They're very much into advocating for their people, which I appreciate. I know how they feel. There's a lot of misunderstandings, and they want to set the record straight. So, but they are unique community. For our purposes, knowing them, understanding them is key, because if we want to delve into the texts, and particularly New Testament mentions Samaritans quite a few times, we really need to understand who they are, what they're all about, what they're into. You're not done. That's okay. That's all right. I understand. People look forward to a whole week. I'm sure. Yeah, that's more cowbells. Yeah, that's I don't know. It's okay. All right, ladies and gentlemen, say to people in the hallway out there getting coffee, tea, that join us. I know there's an audience online that would like to get us rolling in the right direction, so I can jump into my topic. I wanted to remind to you what a few things that I said last time, just because sometimes people come and they miss, and they miss a lot because they don't remember what I said, 3 weeks or 4 weeks or 5 weeks ago. But let me just segue you into this week.
Can we please have some respect for the rabbi? I like to listen.
So, Judeans, Southern Israelites, and Samaritans, Northern Israelites, they have been developing parallel cultures, not always intersecting cultures, since the days of the divided kingdom of Israel. So you've been studying the scriptures, especially since the days of Ezra and Nehemiah, is when we have a sharp division that starts to emerge between the people of the north and the people of the south. And the people of the north start their own religion. Remember, they have their own religious center, they have their own sacrifices, they have their own rituals. They kind of have this rogue, Israel going on there in the north. And they have their own ideas, their own spirituality, which they're not exactly going to follow everything Jerusalem says. So as they develop their own culture, they get conquered by the Assyrians, get taken away in captivity. People can say, didn't you listen to the prophets? That's what happened. So, but then southern Israel gets conquered as well later. So we have these two communities basically at odds with each other and drifting further and further apart and creating these alternative versions of Judaism. What does it mean to be an Israelite? So that's really where the story of Samaritans gets super, super interesting and important for us. I've mentioned several things that I've been teaching about Samaritans. I talked about how they differed with Jews, with Judeans, with Southern Israelites on holy books. They don't have the same holy books. The halacha is different. The way they understand, the way they interpret the scripture is different. The calendar is different. They don't exactly celebrate things on the same dates. Why? Because they don't interpret Torah the same way. And possibly, we talked about last week in particular about the matter of resurrection. Do they even believe in the resurrection? We brought up the verses about the Samaritan woman where Yeshua talks about the water of life, living waters, all that kind of stuff. And she is not entirely tracking. She's not on the same page with him. When he starts talking about this very spiritual topic of living waters, she keeps bringing him back to the very non-spiritual, mundane things like, how you're going to give me this water? You don't have anything to scoop it up with. This well is deep. And I would like to have some really nice fresh water, because that's what living waters really means. It means nice and fresh and good tasting stuff that hasn't been sitting stale and still. So she keeps avoiding, sort of say, the spirituality of that conversation. And Yeshua starts talking about living waters, the eternal life, and that just kind of gets all glossed over, right? So we've talked about that. So it's quite possible, and I showed you some verses from the traditional Jewish sources, from Mishnah and the Gemara, that basically speak about Samaritans, the Kutim, or as how they're called sometimes Minim. They're called Minim. Why? Because they're different kinds of people. Rabbis called anybody who doesn't follow their way a min, meaning a Jew of a different variety. I know it gets translated as a heretic, but that's really what it means. So they're called Minim sometimes. They're called Kutim, because they're from Kutha. And maybe they did not believe in resurrection. Why would they not believe in resurrection? Well, because they only have the 5 books of Moses. And many of the messages that you and I draw on when we talk about resurrection come from where? They don't come from the 5 books of Moses. It's not easy to teach resurrection by simply basing everything you're going to say on the 5 books of Moses. I can go to take you to Daniel, I can take you to the prophets, I can take you to Ezekiel, I can take you to so many different places and teach about resurrection any day. That's easy. But you say to me, stay in the 5 books of Moses and teach me about resurrection from there. And I'm going to be really hard pressed to do that. It's going to take a lot of imagination and creativity for me to be able to help you see that there is such thing as a resurrection of the dead from just 5 books of Moses alone. If they only embrace the 5 books of Moses, it makes sense that they might not have been on the same page with Judeans on this issue of resurrection. And of course, they would have been very, very far away from the Pharisees. And remember, Yeshua, he tends to hang out with the Pharisees a lot. He has a lot of overlap in theology with them. So he certainly believes the same way when it comes to resurrection. But one thing that united them is that they both believed in Messiah, who will reveal God like Moses did. So I don't know if you realize this or not, but Samaritans have a belief in Messiah. They actually have some writings that indicate that they also believe the Messiah figure one day coming. And of course, it's Messiah like Moses. And we're talking about Deuteronomy 18. That's really, if all you have is 5 books of Moses to go by, what messianic beliefs could you develop of a 5 books of Moses? Of course, if I tell you the prophets are in, you're going to bring me all kinds of verses about the Messiah. But if I say only the 5 books of Moses, well, there's going to be a very limited picture of the Messiah that you're going to develop from those books, if any. Because a lot of the interpretations in the Torah that we make messianic, they are interpretations. And most of them, by the way, are rabbinic. Okay? If you're going to take me to the verses in Genesis where Eve receives a promise that you're going to have the son, and the son is going to do these things, he's going to, step his foot on the snake, and you're going to tell me that's the Messiah, wonderful, that's great, but I got news for you. That's rabbinic interpretation. The rabbis came up with that idea. They developed it, they made it popular, and off it went. But what if you're not part of that community of the rabbis? Then you may not interpret that verse the same way. So all of a sudden, you have a different way of reading it. And all of a sudden, your Torah doesn't read the same way because you weren't listening to the same conversation that the rest of the Jewish people have been listening this whole time. So there's a divergence even of what people think the Messiah will be like, what he will do, and the expectations are quite different because you actually have different points of reference. You had something?
And they don't interpret like the rabbinical interpretations like positive and negative statements. Like the statement, to this day there's arisen no one like Moses. Well, that in the rabbinical mind, to this day means, well, one day that
will change, yes.
Yeah. So,
because the Torah says, and there hasn't been anyone like until this day. Well, what is that day?
They say this day is because, but if they're not open to the because, then yeah, it's very difficult.
So there's a bit of a difference, as I've been trying to highlight, between the rabbinic community, between rabbinic beliefs and what Samaritans embraced. And I showed you last time of how the rabbis treat Samaritans, and it's not really a uniform way. Some of them like them, some of them don't like them, some of them say some very disparaging things, but if you read them in context, it's actually not that bad. And I showed you how reading the rabbis in context makes a lot of sense, which sometimes people just are too lazy to look up the entire reference and read a little bit broader and stop mischaracterizing what people actually said and what they meant by those words. But that happens all day long. People take somebody's words out of context. That's nothing new. So I'm going to bring you back to John chapter 4. So we're reading Yochanan, okay? So remember where we stopped. We stopped at this place. So Yeshua told her, he's having a conversation with a Samaritan woman at the well, and they're having this really nice spiritual conversation because he tells her about the living water, eternal life, and then she says, okay, give me some of this water. So this is great. She's actually responding in a positive way. So here's a Samaritan woman who's not supposed to like this Judean rabbi. She's responding to him in a positive way. You know, he's a man, she's a woman. There's a lot of things that are going there that interculturally might create attention of all sorts. But she's responding positively, says, okay, give me that water. I'm good. I'll take it. And he says, go call your husband and then come back. Well, that gets him into this whole conversation about no husband. So, well, the question that I asked last time is, why is her husband needing to drink the special water? And because the truth is that Yeshua is not offering her mere water, his offer has to do with eternal life. This is a spiritual manner. This is a spiritual decision. Eternal life means resurrection. If Samaritans don't believe in resurrection, as you know, Rabbi Ricky Ricardo used to say, you got some splaining to do, right? You have to be brought in onto this train before you can really embrace the whole entire message. Sorry, I just smichad Ricky Ricardo. Everybody becomes rabbi in my speeches sometimes. You know, I'll put a smicha on anyone if I want to quote them. It just makes it sound holier, right? All right, so John chapter 4. She answers. The woman answered and said, I have no husband. And then Jesus said to her, you have correctly said, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one whom you now have is not your husband. This you said truly. The woman said to him, Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. So that right there is a key word for us. So they have this conversation back and forth, and somehow Yeshua has this supernatural knowledge about her private life. I mean, this is pretty intimate. When you know how many husbands somebody had, that person you just met, and all of a sudden, like, you know their family history, that's odd, right? You don't just bump into people somewhere and say, oh, by the way, I know everything about your family history. If you say that to somebody, they're going to say, I perceive you have some unusual gifts and abilities. You know things that nobody should know, and I've never met you before, and I haven't told you a story, so how do you know these things? So she says, you must be a prophet. Why is she saying that? Well, because Jews like Samaritans expected for a prophet like Moses would come one day, and that prophet is going to be like Moses. Moses knew things he should not have known, right? He was shown all kinds of wonderful things by Hashem, and he could say those things to people, and maybe this prophet is just like him, because after all, that's what the Torah promises.
She don't accept the other prophets, right? So this may have been in her mind.
This is
the
the
prophet
prophet
since Moses.
First prophet since Moses. Because remember, what does the Torah say about these things, right? So Deuteronomy 18 is your operative place in the Torah that you need to know about, because I think what this conversation is about, you know, take it or leave it, but this is my opinion. I think this conversation is really undergirded by Deuteronomy 18. She knows her Torah. Please understand, this is not some woman out there from the middle of nowhere. This Samaritan woman knows her Torah. She knows exactly what to believe in, and she's having an intelligent conversation with the Judean rabbi, talking about halacha, purity, uncleanness, you know, how can I give you my stuff to drink from? She understands all the tensions that exist between Jews and Samaritans, and so yet, right there, she says, you might be a prophet. How do you know these kinds of things? So what is she talking about? Well, she's talking about this verse. So this is a New Revised Standard Version. It's a good translation. Deuteronomy 18:18. I will raise up for them a prophet. So look like this. And it says, V'navi ekum lachem. I will raise them a prophet like you. Okay? Mikivbecha kamocha. Kamocha means like you. He's going to be like you. Who is God speaking to? He's speaking to Moshe. From among their own people. So that means there's going to be one of you from your own people will be a prophet like you. I will put my words in his mouth, of that prophet, who shall speak to them everything that I command. So God has some more things to say. Apparently, he didn't say everything to Moses. This is a novel idea for a lot of people, okay? I realize that I'm crossing into territory. God did not say everything he wanted to say to Moses. He had a few more things that we weren't ready for, let's put it that way. So he was going to continue. He was planning on continuing to speak. Brit Hadashah, by the way, says the same exact thing. That in the past, God has revealed himself to us through Moses, prophets, and then on and on and on. And that he continues to speak to us in many ways. And so right there, we're told that there's going to be a prophet like, it says, Kamocha, like you, Moses, from among the people. And this is what Samaritans look at. And by the way, I actually pulled up the Samaritan Torah. Samaritan Torah sometimes differs from the Torah we read. But I actually have a text, so I pulled it up, and I verified it. And it actually says the same exact thing. So no changes in that verse whatsoever. Samaritans look at this prophet, okay, this Navi it says, a prophet. And they call him Tahib, which means the one who returns, or that's what it literally means. And it's an idea is very similar to the Jewish concept of Messiah. The one who comes, the one who returns. And so it's that, because it's a prophet like Moses, so it's almost like a return of Moses again. It's like this is the second Moses coming to us. We get that idea. So however you want to frame that, in your understanding, that's the way they saw it, that's the way they understood it. So they're expecting that there will come this prophet who will do what? He will speak to them everything that I command. Meaning there are some things that God has commanded that we're having a little bit of trouble with. God has said a lot of commandments in the Torah. And not all of them are so straightforward that we can just say, okay, I know exactly what he meant. We have a lot of questions. Do you know one of the most difficult and one of the most contended commandments in the Torah? Anybody knows? You would be surprised. Shabbat. The rules of Shabbat, the things that we do, the rabbis say, is like a mountain suspended by a horsehair. Meaning we have so little to go on. God says, this is the Shabbat, keep it holy. And then he kind of left a lot of that for us. Like, how do we keep it holy? What exactly do we do? He gave us very few, very concrete things about Shabbat. And he didn't tell us, do not do any kind of work. But he didn't explain what kind of work we're supposed to do, what is work, what is not work, what is allowed, what is forbidden. All of those rules and traditions that we have had to kind of extrapolate from the few things that God actually did say to Moshe. But you realize that God didn't just lay it out for us. So that situation like that would really be nice if we had another prophet like Moses who could say, by the way, guys, this is what God really meant. Why? Because we had a meeting yesterday and he explained that to me. That kind of stuff. So we need that. Torah needs an interpretation. Torah needs somebody who would come along and say, this is what God really means. If you read the commandments the first time around as you encounter them when Moshe is given them, and then you go to Deuteronomy and you read the same exact commandments, they're being explained more elaborately, with greater detail, sometimes with caveats, depths of all sorts. And so we take that all together as a collective understanding and knowledge, and we grow on that. And so Samaritans believe that one day a prophet will come who will clear up a whole bunch of things that they had questions about, they didn't really know what to do with. Because all these commandments, not so self-explanatory. So here's an interesting quote from Josephus that I want to share with you. I share Josephus a lot with you because I find him to be a very prolific writer. So he talks about the hope of the Samaritans in coming of this prophet. And this one particular describes actual coming of someone who claimed to be that very prophet who everyone's been waiting for. So Josephus in Antiquities 18 writes, a man who made light of honesty, and in all his designs catered to the mob, rallied them meaning Samaritans, bidding them to go in a body with him to Mount Gerizim. So there's somebody there that gathering the people together, which is in their belief the most sacred of mountains. So we're talking about Samaritans. He assured them that on their arrival, he would show to them the sacred vessels which were buried there, where Moses had deposited them. Now we know for a fact Moses never made it to Mount Gerizim because God specifically told him, do not cross, right? But it doesn't matter. I'm going to say that I have some special stuff that I want to show you that goes back to the days of Moses. So he made some promises to people that he's going to show them sacred things on top of Mount Gerizim. They just need to come along. And so Josephus continues to write, says his hearers, viewing this as possible or plausible, this is something that they said, oh, maybe he is the prophet we've been waiting for, appeared in arms. They didn't just come, they came armed. They posted themselves in a certain village named Tirathana, and they planned to climb the mountain in great multitude. And they welcomed to their ranks the new arrivals who kept coming. But before they could ascend, Pilate, somebody you should know about, blocked their projected route up the mountain with a detachment of cavalry and heavily armed infantry, who in an encounter with the first comers of the village slew some of them and pitched battle and put the others to flight. So they ran because the Romans put up their cavalry. They could not fight them off. There was no way now they were going to go up top of the mountain. Many prisoners were taken, whom Pilate put to death, the principal leaders and those who were most influential among the fugitives. Oh, how he put them to death? I mean, he crucified them. Yeah, that's the Roman way of dealing with political prisoners. Because what's going on right here in these verses? I want you to realize Josephus is writing us a history, an account of a pretender, as far as he's concerned, a messianic claimant, a man who comes up and he says to the Samaritans, come with me to the top of the Mount Gerizim, I'm going to show you some wondrous things, some miraculous things, some amazing relics of the past, And they have a hope that he is a prophet like Moses, who actually has a connection to Moses, who's going to do this. Moses even gets mentioned in these verses. So even though Josephus is writing this to Romans, he's throwing in enough details that we know what he's talking about exactly, where the Romans are kind of like swimming out there wondering what that is all about. So you guys have an actual benefit reading Josephus because you actually understand all this stuff that Romans are only hoping to understand. So there's this messianic pretender who says, I'm going to take you to the top of the mountain and show you some amazing things. And they believe him. They actually find this plausible. Now, why do they find this plausible? That a man is going to come who's going to tell you, hey, let's go to the top of Mount Gerizim and I'm going to set the record straight. Because they have a hope in the Messiah, that a person like that will come. They're leaning that hope on something. Unfortunately, as it didn't come out, for them, it was a very unfortunate end. Pilate hears about this. And what is Pilate interested in? Does Pilate care about the Messiah? Does Pilate care who is the Messiah? What is the Messiah? No. All he knows, there's a bunch of armed people getting ready to ascend Mount Gerizim, and who knows what they're going to do there. They're going to establish a fort. They're going to start an army. Before you know, they're going to start an insurrection. Now this whole country is going to be enveloped in war. What does Pilate want? No war. Taxes. We need to keep that flowing. The economy needs to keep going. People need to keep paying taxes. So let me take a few of these rebels and deal with them swiftly. And that's what he does. He brings the military with him and crushes that potential Messiah who's going to show them something wonderful on top of Mount Gerizim. And he takes prisoners, crucifies the ones that he catches, the other ones flee, they run. Now, why is Josephus telling us this story? Because he wants us to know that there were people who would claim to be the Messiah, and among them were Samaritans. So what does that tell us? It tells us the Samaritans believed such a thing. And this is from the end of the first century of the Common Era. So what I say is what I say, but what I say is based on these types of documents that we can dig up from antiquity that tells us these things. As I said, most of the Samaritan internal writings are actually belong to the 4th, 5th century and on. They're more from the era of Talmudic era, but this is very, very ancient. It's much, much older. Information about Samaritans. So did they believe in a prophet like Moses? I say yes. At least passages like this tend to indicate that they actually did. Josephus believed it, and that's the stories that he told us about the Samaritans. So back to that verse. It's all about the prophet. But the question is, if Yeshua maybe is this prophet, and she's wondering this, in a minute she's going to ask him some questions. But why is he so bent about her not having a husband? That's the question that just keeps plaguing us. The Samaritan woman a lot of times people read this story, they read this in a kind of an interesting way. The Samaritan woman comes to the well. She comes in the heat of the day. She comes, the story says, in noontime. So if you want to avoid people, okay, you go to the place where people gather to chat and discuss all things at the time when nobody's there. Heat of the day, the worst time possible to go to the well, that's when she goes. Why? Because she obviously is trying to avoid people. She's avoiding people. And the question that comes into people's mind, why is she avoiding people? Is she ashamed of something? So again, remember, reading text is all about the preconceived ideas you bring to it. So Yeshua tells us that she was married. She was married 5 times. Well, that's definitely unusual behavior. Okay, maybe today that's a normal thing, but back then in antiquity, married 5 times, that's a lot. Okay, so that just something doesn't sit well. So this woman has been married 5 times. Why did she not stay married? What was she looking for? Why is she living with a man who is not her husband? Because Yeshua just told her, yes, you have had 5 husbands, and now the man you're living with is not even your husband. Is that acceptable? Is she promiscuous? And what kind of a woman are we talking about? Guess what? The church tradition and the commentaries are going to exactly paint this woman as some terrible, awful sinner who is living with another man out of wedlock, have had 5 husbands, changes them all the time, and she's not happy, and so she's just on the next one right now, or on the next potential right now, whatever it is. But that's how she's going to be painted in church tradition. And that's how that commentary goes. If you look at every piece of art of Jesus ever talking to Samaritan woman, and I say, just go, I don't care where you go to all the museums in the world, and look for paintings of Jesus and the Samaritan woman. She's always going to look really young and attractive. In some paintings, she will have nakedness hanging right out, because that was cool back then, of painting women that way. But as she's having a conversation with a Judean rabbi, I'm sorry, just, Middle Ages and art, they had some weird ideas of what's Roman thing. It's a Roman thing, honestly. Yeah, and he looks like a guy from Sweden anyway, so it doesn't matter. But you have to look at those paintings, and she's always like beautiful. She's decked out. She's dressed up. I mean, she's like going out on a date. That woman is in the noontime trying to draw water from the well, and she does not want to be seen. I actually think she's having the worst day of her life, probably. Probably very unhappy, and definitely does not have her makeup on. And then she meets this guy who asks her for water. There are many assumptions, there are many questions. Most of them about this woman are completely culturally driven by conversations that actually should not even be there. So we make judgments by asking these types of questions of the texts, which are actually inappropriate, because for marital status or behavior, you really need to take into account the dynamics of the ancient marriage laws and the social norms, and really the antiquity, because we read the story as if it happened yesterday, as if this is the woman we know, as this is the kind of a behavior that we actually understand. So I want for us for a moment to compare her life to another story. And some of you may have heard me read the story to you before, but in the book of Tobit, this is a 2nd century BCE book, there's a Jewish woman who's named Sarah, who was stigmatized by those who surrounded her, particularly by her servants, because of the death of her multiple husbands. Now, if you read the book of Tobit, you will realize that there's some demonic involvement that happened there. The Tobit tells us that the evil demon Asmodeus actually came and killed off her husbands before she could enjoy to be married to them. And that happened over and over and over. Only readers of the story know this. Even Sarah does not know that this is happening in her life. She's questioning, what's going on with me? Am I cursed? What's going on? And so these deaths of her husbands, one after another, they're considered like a curse from God. So as this young woman who wants to be married, because that's the normal thing to do, to get married, to have children, have a family, she would like to marry, but who's going to want to become number 8? The 7 guys she married dropped dead before they can consummate the marriage. Would you like to be a guy number 8? So if you know that history, how much convincing is it going to take for you to agree to that arrangement and go for that ketubah? It might take a lot. Yeah, you wouldn't want to eat or drink anything. Like, bring your own food. You don't know what's happening, but like her husbands are dropping dead. So nobody understands what's going on except the writer of the book of Tobit, because he tells us this is a demonic activity. It's an attack that's happening on this woman. So in the story, she cries out. And so this is a little bit from Tobit right there. You can read the book of Tobit. This is a Revised Standard Version. It's in the Bibles. It's not Protestant. You can find it in the Catholic Bible if you want to. Sarah, the daughter of Raguel, was reproached by one of her father's maids. For she had been married to 7 husbands, and the wicked demon Asmodeus had killed each of them before they had been with her, as is customary for wives. So the maid said to her, "You are the one who kills your husbands. See, you have already been married to 7 husbands and have not borne the name of a single one of them. Why do you beat us? Because your husbands are dead? Go with them. Maybe you never see a son or daughter of yours." Now that's a servant talking back to the master. Ouch. That's pretty bad, right? But what I want you to realize is how this woman, Sarah, feels. She's devastated. She's traumatized. Every guy she marries dies. She hasn't done anything wrong as far as she knows, and yet everybody drops dead. And she does not get to have a happily ever after, ever. She gets to say, "I do," and that's it. After that, it's over. So she's traumatized. And people start bringing her down and talking to her, saying, "Something's wrong with you. That's why your husbands are all dying. It's because of you. You have done something wrong. Something is really, you're cursed. You're cursed to them. You're poisonous. They're all dying." Whatever hurtful things that she has received in her, towards her, in her direction, she cries out in the book of Tobit. You can read it. I'm not going to quote that, but she starts basically just begging God in prayer. Really, really beautiful heartfelt prayer. In the story, Sarah, she's distressed to the point of suicide. She basically says, "I'm going to take my life. I can't live like this anymore." So in her prayer that follows this story in Tobit 3, she maintains her innocence. She says, "I haven't done anything." She does not understand her suffering or punishment. And so my question is it possible the Samaritan woman experienced some sort of a misfortune with her husbands, just like this woman, Sarah, in the book of Tobit? And the answer is, we don't know. We are not told what happened to her husbands. The reason why she's living with a man who's not her husband, we have no idea. Nobody actually told us. We're reading all of that between the lines. Because what we're taking a cultural behavior that we know, where people just get into all kinds of relationships they want to willy-nilly, and then break off those relationships, get into another relationships willy-nilly, and then on and on and on. And we are familiar with that culture. And we assume that that's how they did it back then and back there. But the truth is they didn't. And we don't understand how marriages happened back then. And so I'm going to bring in the fact that, when Drake was teaching about the ketubot and the whole marriage divorce, that was a great topic, by the way. You've explained that in detail. So I'm going to build on this and bring this in. Ancient Israelite weddings had 2 stages. It's important to understand. There was a stage called the Erusin, which is the betrothal. That's when we make proclamations and promises to each other we're going to marry. And that's when the contract, the ketubah, is actually written. And there's the Nisuin. The Nisuin is the actual wedding. It's the actual event of people coming together. So the couple were legally married from the moment of the betrothal. The moment you agreed, that's it. You signed the dotted line. You're married. That piece of paper says, she's yours, you're his, all of your inheritance, whatever the terms you agreed on, they're there. So, though often actually people, they remained apart. People remained apart until the actual wedding day. So you could sign the paperwork and then get married later. So that there was a period between the Erusin and Nisuin. And sometimes that period was long, sometimes it was short. So breaking up a marriage during this waiting period actually required what we call a formal divorce, a get. An example is Joseph and Mary in Matthew chapter 1, verse 19. Remember? They already are betrothed. She becomes pregnant. And Joseph is very sure that it's not his. Right? So he wants to divorce her. Quietly, he wants to put her away. Not shame her publicly, but just like, all right, let's just make this disappear. And why does he need to do that if they're not married? And the truth is that as far as they're concerned, as far as their culture, as far as their custom, they were married because they already belonged to each other on paper, even though they did not come together as a husband and wife because the wedding day has not happened. But as far as the paperwork, it was signed. They were legally married.
That's also kind of a nod to the fact that he's probably obtaining a Hillelite divorce because they were the quiet ones.
Right, they were the quiet ones. The not shaming a woman was a very dignified way of saying, let's do this and let's break this off and let's not make this an issue that's going to really destroy this woman, essentially. Because if there is a fault in her, like clearly in Mary getting pregnant, not by a person who's supposed to be her betrothed, that's a scandal. That's a serious matter. I mean, who's going to want that after that?
You know, in a Shamite court, which I think only like 20% of the courts at that time were actually like Shamite courts, you would actually convoke everybody into a public area, a court setting. Evidence would be brought, names would be, people would be put on the stand, facts would be proven. It would be, you'd be dragged through the mud essentially.
Right.
So there might have been some. And my point is, the New Testament seems to suggest that there might have been some cases in which a Hillelite divorce wasn't an abuse, but might actually be a way to protect somebody.
So what Drake is talking about is there's a disagreement between Hillel and Shammai, fundamental to how the divorces are being done, to what degree and what reasons and what grounds and what terms and how the process actually works. And so some courts would do it one way and other courts do it another way. They both accepted each other's rulings. They mutually recognized each other's rulings as valid, but they disagreed on how it should be done. And what it comes down to is really the point of Jewish ethics and interpretation of the passages and how people feel about these interpretations of the law, basically. What does the Torah say and what do we believe it actually means? So imagine this waiting period. And the time between two stages of marriage could be months, could be a year, could be even longer. And so deaths can occur, infidelity can occur in this span of time. All sorts of accidents can happen, wars can break out. Who knows how she lost all of her husbands? We don't know. We just know that this was very, very hard for her.
Just as an aside, too, if I was not familiar with the Jewish wedding, both Erusin and Nisuin still exist in the wedding. They're just done together now.
Right. So in a modern Jewish wedding ceremony, the Erusin and Nisuin are actually combined into one day. So there's no waiting period. Because the couple signs the ketubah. You know, the witnesses come, they agree, the couple agrees to ketubah, the witnesses sign the ketubah, sometimes the rabbi signs the ketubah, he's one of the witnesses, and then they go directly to the chuppah, and that's where the wedding happens.
Even the first prayers under the chuppah are still Erusin,
Right.
and then it moves into Nisuin.
So we actually took two things that existed in antiquity and made them really, really close together by reducing that waiting period to nothing, essentially. It's in the middle of the ceremony. So it still exists. The structure still exists. But the way people do things today have changed. So is it possible that something happening in this Samaritan woman's life, like similar to the Sarah story that I'm talking about, you know, is it possible that the husbands of the Samaritan woman somehow met their end or died or divorced her maybe? Maybe they did divorce her. We don't know. But does that necessarily mean it was her fault every single time? We have no idea, and we can't make these judgments because that's actually not part of the story. But we do, because we want to present the Samaritan woman in a very particular light. And so because church tradition has made her out to be a terrible sinner who comes up to the well to look for men or something like that, you know, which men are not going to be at the well except Yeshua, he was thirsty. So that's unfortunate of how she gets, you know, dumped on, essentially, in a very unkind way. Yes?
You know, just the fact that he actually calls those four other men husbands, it's a small detail.
Yeah.
But if she were a sota and she had an illegitimate divorce or something of that nature on her first marriage, you wouldn't call those other people afterwards husbands.
Because they legally were not.
Yes, and so he's actually saying, to some extent, you know, it might be
legal marriages.
Yes.
That were somehow went sideways, and she's alone, and she's living right now with someone who's not her husband, which for most people means she has a boyfriend, right? Because that's what our 21st century tells us. People have a boyfriend, a girlfriend, they move in together, they share an apartment, whatever. Is that how that happened 2,000 years ago, you think?
Well, something David Inston Brewer pointed out, after your first or second rodeo when it came to marriage, people never made a big deal about it. The dowry was smaller, the big wedding feast and the reception it was not so much an ordeal. People were like, eh. And so it was sort of like a calm afterlife for people to, I guess older folks that had.
It's true.
Yeah.
It's true. I mean, that's the way of the culture. Yes. And
It's not exactly the same, but the story with Tamar and Yehuda would be very close to this situation.
yeah. So that's a difficult story. I have to teach on it one of these days. That's a difficult one to unravel, as we're dealing with some practices that no longer exist in Israel, but did back in those days. So, all right, let's keep moving on. I want you to focus on the Samaritans a little bit more. It's important to understand who the Samaritan woman was, and I feel like I have to rehabilitate her character a little bit. So she's perceiving that she's speaking to no ordinary Judean, possibly a prophet. The woman asked most contentious and difficult question to test her suspicions. What she's going to ask, for Samaritans, that would be a very predictable question, because what's one big thing that Samaritans disagreed with Jews about? Where should we worship, right? And she says, our ancestors worship on this mountain, but you Jews claim to the place where we must worship is in Jerusalem. So she says, all right, which side are you going to take? See, this is what we call, it's time to take a side. So she calls him out, and now she's going to test him. If she's really the Samaritan prophet, then he's going to take her side, right? If he's a Judean prophet, then of course he's going to take a Judean side. That's kind of what she expects. Yeshua gives her an answer that's actually very brilliant in my idea. So he says, woman, Jesus replied, believe me, a time is coming when you will worship Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. So I'm not going to take either side, is what he's saying. You Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. For salvation is from the Jews. So then he does take the side. Yet a time is coming, and has now come, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For they are the kind of worshipers the Father seeks. So now he presents yet another. There's like three things right here in this text that I want you to see. First he says, temple seems to be not important. Then he says, you Samaritans don't really know what you're worshiping. And then he says, don't worry, the time is coming where things are going to change. The kind of worshipers the Father seeks, they're going to be worshiping him in a different way anyway. That verse gets some very interesting commentaries. If you pick up some books off the shelf and start reading the explanation of that verse, it usually goes in a very, very anti-temple way. Let's put it that way. So what is Yeshua saying? In the minds of many Christians, he says, the temple does not matter. Let go of that nonsense. Just worship God in spirit and in truth. Whatever that means. Try to define that one based on the verses in John. I have no idea what Yeshua is talking about. Well, I have an idea, but I can't tell you unequivocally what he means by spirit and truth. I have a lot of ideas about that, but it'll take me hours to unpack why I think what I think. But nevertheless, he says, does he say the temple does not matter? Does he say all of this is nonsense? Well, remember who he is talking to and who is he speaking with. And so Yeshua is a Jew who worshipped at the temple regularly. That's what we have to understand. All the commentators take that for granted. They're like, oh yeah, it's just what Jews do. It's kind of like comes with it. He defended the dignity of the temple by getting angry at its mistreatment. If he doesn't care about the temple, why would he go around turning on tables? Unless he passionately believed that the temple is a place where God is, and it needs to be protected and defended from these people who are making a mockery of it. Yeah, he was passionate about it. Samaritans, they lost their temple just a couple of generations ago because the Jews destroyed it. I want you to understand the tension in this conversation. The Jews destroyed our temple. You tell us to keep going and worship in Jerusalem, and we are not going to. Why? So we don't like you, because you destroyed our temple. You don't like us, we don't like you back. In fact, we don't like so many things about you, and we disagree with you. And so he's talking, and she's asking this question, and it's so contentious. And then he starts talking about, not worry about Jerusalem, don't worry about Gerizim and things like that. But yet at the same time, he himself goes to Jerusalem regularly, all the time. In fact, one of the times that he goes to Jerusalem, he passes through Samaria, and remember, Samaritans deny him hospitality. Why? Because he's going to Jerusalem to worship at the feast. And as soon as they find out that that's what he's going to do, they're like, well, we don't have any food for you. We don't have a place for you to stay. There's no room in the inn. Please keep on moving. Why? Because we don't want to support people like you. We don't want to enable that pilgrimage to Jerusalem. So, everyone tells Samaritans they should go and sacrifice in Jerusalem just like everybody else does. But Yeshua's response is to stop her from getting all upset about who is right and who's wrong. Because in the minds of many people, it's about who's right and who's wrong. But in a very indirect way, he says, soon the Jerusalem temple will be destroyed. You know, you're all upset about your temple being destroyed? Don't worry. The Jerusalem temple will also be destroyed very soon. He says it in a very roundabout way. I don't know if you can hear this or not in John, but he actually does. He says, woman, let me tell you something. A time is coming. A time is coming. And that time will come. But something is going to happen that's going to make you change your mind of how you feel about Jews. Maybe you will be identifying with them in a much more clear way.
He said you won't worship here at this mountain or Jerusalem.
Neither place.
Take that out.
Yeah, because everybody's going to suffer in ways that they don't even know that's going to happen. Yes, Jeremy?
Some interesting context that is absolutely in alignment with what you're saying is the 70 weeks prophecy in Daniel.
Mm-hmm.
So, there's a very famous and infamous verse, 26 in chapter 9, and it says, and after the 62 weeks, which is the 69th week, won't get into the details here, the Messiah shall be cut off. Karat, it's literally execution.
It's the anointed one, yeah.
But not for himself. And the people of the prince who is to come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary, and the end of it shall be with the flood. Until the end, war and desolations are determined. And it goes on. But it's interesting in the Septuagint, which was a translation of the Hebrew approximately 270 years before Yeshua came. It literally translated the Messiah as Christ.
Right.
Christ.
It's Christos, yeah.
Yeah.
Christos means an anointed one.
Exactly.
Which, by the way, I want to take your mind a little bit broader. Who are anointed in the temple? That's right. Every single priest is anointed. So read that verse in a multidimensional way. I know that verse has been a proof text for a long time, and people always want to run to it the traditional proof text way. But that's one thing about proof texting. It doesn't always work when you take them out of context. Read them in context, and please understand what that says. So, yeah, can that text be understood in a variety of different ways? Absolutely. It's a multi-layered text, but don't take it just plain as it is. Explore every one of them. So it's a fascinating text. Thank you for bringing that. There is this idea of the destruction of Jerusalem that comes up in the prophets, and we know that. That's an obvious one, and that's a good passage right there. So he tells this woman, let me tell you, a time is going to come. You're going to feel differently. So just as Samaritans have departed from truth, Jews are violating the covenant at that point too, and they will be in the same position as Samaritans very soon. That's what Yeshua is basically saying. The time is coming when no one will tell you to go worship in Jerusalem. Why? Because there will be no Jerusalem to go worship in. It will be destroyed. But, he says, you should still listen to the Jews because we know what we worship. Because don't forget that part. After he tells her, don't worry about Jerusalem, Gerizim. I know this is most important to you right now. But let's focus on what's really important. You actually do not know what you're doing. You don't know what you're doing. Look to Jews. He says, you Samaritans worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. For salvation is from the Jews. That's the key word. That's the one that I didn't say, that he said, but he actually did say, John 4:22. When Yeshua spoke of salvation being from Jews, he actually hinted at what the Torah says about the neighboring Judah. Remember, Judah, Yehudah, Yehudim, that's a collective term. So he says salvation is from Judah, literally. So if you're a Samaritan living right next to Judea, you're being told that your salvation is from Judea. You stopped looking to Judea as a place of salvation, but that's where your salvation is going to come in a very, very little way. And he does this on purpose that way because he wants her to go to a verse that he knows, she knows, because this is, as she admitted herself, her forefather. She says, our father Jacob. Remember that conversation? Did his flock, gave water to his flocks from this well, and so do we today. So Genesis 49 is the story of Jacob blessing Judah. And this is what he says. Judah, your brothers will praise you. Your hand will be on the neck of your enemies. Your father's sons will bow down to you. Judah is not the oldest, by the way. The scepter will not depart from Judah. Scepter is a royal authority, nor the ruler's staff between his feet, until he comes to whom it belongs. And that there uses the word Shiloh. And the obedience of the nations is his. You can look up, just curiously, I always look for very, very ancient commentaries on things. So I decided to go and look up Targum on this verse. Targum is an Aramaic translation. Before there was a Greek translation of the Hebrew, into Greek, there was a translation of Hebrew into Aramaic. It predates that. So I looked at it. Guess what it says? It says Messiah, which basically means Messiah. That place where it says Shiloh, instead of Shiloh, it just says, you need to, the scepter will not depart from him until the Messiah comes. That's what the Targum says. Targum is an interpretive translation, and that's what it does. It tells you, don't be guessing who the Shiloh is. Let me tell you straight. It's the Messiah. That's what the Targum says. So Targum translates that verse very clearly as the Messiah. So that means that ancient Jews knew that this verse in Genesis 49 was about the Messiah. And since they are on the topic of Messiah, the Samaritan woman and Yeshua, what do you think other verses besides Deuteronomy 18 that she's going to go to, that is the Messiah verse in the Torah that she knows and that he knows as well? Well, that would be the verse that would have to come up. And so Yeshua beautifully puts it back in, and he says, guess what? Salvation, Yeshua, your redemption, your rescue, Samaritans, will come from Yehuda, from Judah. That's where it's going to come from. Because we actually know what we're doing. We are part of this. And you have forgotten this part. And you have become self-centered, and you are not looking to Judah as the place from whom the Messiah will come. You keep looking for a Messiah that's going to tell you that Mount Gerizim is the place you should worship. And he says, I'm not going to tell you that. So that's a big one to swallow for her.
I don't have a reference here, but allegedly in my reading I've heard that around the time of the first century, around the time Yeshua would have been a child, was when the Romans took over the authority of Israel, right? And they lost the right of capital punishment. And so allegedly, rabbis came in mourning to Jerusalem saying, alas, the scepter has departed from Judah and Shiloh has not come.
Right.
If that is true, of course, not knowing that Yeshua had, Messiah had come, was a child.
It's an interesting connection. I have to run that down. That's if there's an actual verse about that happening in traditional Jewish sources, that would be a very interesting one to look up. Thank you for bringing that up. That's cool. So this is another fascinating verse about Messiah. If you ask me to tell you about Messiah from the 5 books of Moses alone, this is where I'm going to go. I'm going to go to Genesis 49 and I'm going to go to Deuteronomy 18. Those are my go-to places. And so that's coincidentally what she's talking to him about. Are you the prophet that are going to come? That's what she's wondering. So the Samaritan woman understood the salvation from Judeans connected to the promise of the Messiah. She clearly knows this. Why? Because she's going to give you the interpretation that has to do with Messiah. And so Yeshua told her that indeed, that's who they have been expecting. So verse 25, the woman said, I know that Messiah, okay, and NASB says called Christ, because everybody needs to understand what that means. They translate English to English here. Is coming. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. So she's like almost quoting Deuteronomy 18, right? When he comes, he will explain everything to us, meaning he will teach us God's commandments. He will explain what we don't understand. Then Jesus declared, I, the one speaking to you, I'm he. Just then his disciples returns and were surprised to find him talking with a woman. Remember I told you, this is a little cultural issue here. He's talking to a woman. But no one asked, what do you want, or why are you talking with her? They just let the rabbi be. He has a reason. Right? He has a reason he's talking to her. So let the rabbi be. They're not going to question him out of respect, even though he's talking to a woman. And they're alone at the well. So that's kind of how the story continues. What I want you to see here is that this is an absolutely unprecedented moment in the gospel stories where Yeshua actually comes out and says, I am he. How many times do Jews of all varieties come to him and say, tell us, are you the Messiah? And he doesn't say it flat out like this. He does not just come out and says, yep, I'm the one. You've been waiting for me all this time. Who does he say that to? To a Samaritan woman. Remember, women are not going to be admitted witnesses of the court. So if anybody was going to accuse him of anything like that, she's not going to be admitted as a credible witness in the court. Because, number one, she's a woman. Number two, she's a Samaritan. 2 strikes against her. So how terrible. So he says these things, but why would he just explain it like that in plain words while he doesn't do it for other people? Well, my answer would be is that she really doesn't have a lot to go on. If all she has is a couple of verses in the Torah to hang that hope in Messiah on, she's going to need some very clear and unambiguous statements like that. I am the one, to convince her. Where, fortunately, those of us who read the prophets, we have so much to go on. We can build the expectation of Messiah and all these things that the prophets have revealed to us. And then when he comes, we could match up the two and say, ooh, maybe this is the one. Because that matches, this matches, this matches, that matches, and all of a sudden, it comes down to an issue of faith. But to her, what is she going to build her faith on? Very few things, which is why he tells her, woman, I'm the one. You've been waiting for me all the time. Yes, Jim.
I can only think of 2 other places where similar, those words are spoken by him. One is where the rabbis are challenging him, and they essentially say, you're not a legitimate child. Mm-hmm. And he says to them, truly, they ask him a very, sarcastic question. You live to see Abraham's day? Mm-hmm. He says, truly I tell you, before Abraham was, I am. When they heard that, you know how significant that was? Because they tried to kill him.
Yeah, but the implication, of course, is a scandalous statement, but you go ahead and try to prove that one in a court of law as meaning, we can twist the meaning of those words in a variety of ways, and you try to prove it that I meant it the way you think I meant it versus I could say I meant it in an entirely different way. This one is very straight.
Absolutely.
And I find it fascinating that this is a woman, and I find it fascinating this is a Samaritan woman, and this woman knows her Torah. That's what's important. Yes.
When the apostles get their marching orders after the resurrection, it says, you will go to the Jews and Samaria, and then to the world. So the Samaritans, they're tiny now, and they were reviled, and they've been kind of reviled in Christian thought, but they apparently were very important.
They were just as numerous as Jews, as Josephus says, as far as numbers go.
To gather them in, to gather everybody to the Jews,
right.
You had to start there and go out.
The role of the Messiah is to unify all Israel, the north and the south. Is it not what it says in the book of Jeremiah? Yeah. I will make my covenant with Judah and Israel.
And the 2 sticks.
And all of this is meant to come together. Messiah is a restorer, not a divider. So you should not be surprised at the fact that he treats Samaritans in a slightly different way than some other people would treat Samaritans. So look what happens next. It says, then leaving her jar, the woman went back to the town and said to people, come, see a man who told me everything I ever did. Maybe a little exaggeration there. Could this be the Messiah? So clearly she understands that she may be talking to the Messiah. They came out of town and made their way toward him. Because she doesn't have a husband, she basically leans now on the authority of the community to decide whether this guy is legit or not. It says, meanwhile, his disciples urged him, Rabbi, eat something. He said to them, I have food to eat that you know nothing about. It's a beautiful story, right? But here's a question I want to ask. Would a pious, Torah-following Samaritan community believe a witness of a loose woman who is just like changing husbands all the time, who's a known sinner? Would they take her witness? Hey, I think I met the Messiah. Come see this guy. Not likely. But would they listen to a woman who was a good, upstanding citizen, maybe in a very unfortunate situation in her life, maybe truly depressed, maybe truly at the bottom of her life at that moment? But they probably would listen to her. They followed her out of town, and as a result, many believed in Yeshua as the Judean Messiah. That's what the story actually tells us. So, would you follow just anybody if they come and tell you, oh, I think the Messiah has come? You're going to say, well, what qualifies you to recognize the Messiah to believe, to begin with? Like, you would follow if somebody that you really respect them, if you think that they actually know what they're talking about. But you're not going to follow just anybody, right? So the community, the townspeople, they actually followed this woman to the outskirts, to the well, to meet this Judean. And that's, out of that story, if you keep reading it, a beautiful thing happens. So I'll rehabilitate it a little bit, Samaritan woman here for you. What I want you to know is that Yeshua was a Judean Israelite who had a positive attitude towards Samaritan Israelites, considering them a part of Israel, and he actually called them a spiritual harvest. If you notice the rest of John, he's actually going to refer to them as a harvest. What does that tell you? So he stayed with them for days, and not only drank their water, but probably ate their food. I know it doesn't say that, but guess what? When you host somebody in your house for days, there's no chance that you're not going to be given food and drink. Nobody ever hosts somebody and says, oh, you go through a drive-through. No, that's not how it works. So as we keep reading the stories, we realize that he had a relationship with Samaritans that was a very open relationship in that way, because he truly believed that they were lost sheep who needed to be brought back. Philip, John, and Peter, they ministered among the Samaritans as well. Linda mentioned that, you go to Judea, Samaria, and the outermost parts of the world, and that's exactly what they did. They actually went, once they finished touring Judea, they moved on to Samaria, and the Samaritans were among the first to follow Yeshua after the news of resurrection. There were some Samaritans who followed Yeshua before he died, because apparently a whole bunch of these village actually became believers in the Judean Messiah, after he explained to them about the resurrection and a few other things. But after the resurrection happened, what do you want to bet? The disciples went back to that village and said, you remember the rabbi said about the resurrection? And you were maybe a little skeptical? Guess what? He did rise from the dead. And they believed. And they were probably the first ones to believe. So that's a part of the story. And as we read the book of Acts, we actually see Samaritans as a part of a first century Messianic community. So is this topic important for us to understand? Is it important for us to understand these people, and how all this history came to be? Hopefully you see the point why I'm bringing you this study about Samaritans now for a few weeks now. So I hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you had fun and that enriched your understanding of the scriptures, maybe opened a few doors in your mind, and I hope that we'll continue doing that again and again.